He only said 26 words. But in those 26 words, William Ruto didn't just shift alliances, he ignited a diplomatic earthquake that cracked the entire post-colonial order.
Kenya and China are not merely trade partners. We are co-architects of a new world order.
That one sentence, delivered calmly in Beijing, sent Washington into panic mode. Within 48 hours, U.S. senators called for sanctions. Within 10 days, Trump's administration drafted legislation to strip Kenya of its major non-NATO ally status. All because Ruto dared to imagine something unthinkable. An Africa no longer asking for permission. But here's what no one saw coming: this wasn't just a speech. It was a blueprint. It was Ruto's warning shot to the old empires: we see your strings. And we're cutting them. And now, the leash they held for 60 years has snapped. If you believe Africa's future shouldn't be decided in foreign capitals, like this video, subscribe, and stay until the end. Because what happens next might change how you see the West. On April 23, 2025, the words were spoken. By May 1, Washington was in full retaliation mode. Senator James Risch stood before Congress, face flushed with fury. He called Ruto's statement a betrayal, not just of the United States, but of the entire Western order. He proposed an amendment to the 2026 Defense Authorization Act. Reassess Kenya's NATO ally status within 90 days. Behind closed doors, the Pentagon was furious. The State Department panicked. But Ruto wasn't apologizing. He wasn't explaining. He was rewriting the rules. And now, this story isn't just about one president. It's about every African nation that dares to say, "We are not yours to manage." Betrayal. That's the word they used. But maybe, just maybe, this time, it's the empire that feels betrayed. For decades, the West shaped the rules. They offered handshakes wrapped in handcuffs, trade deals laced with dependency, military support tied to silence. Then came April 23, 2025. In Beijing, President William Ruto broke the script. He didn't just speak to China. He spoke past it, to a generation of African leaders who've watched their nations become laboratories for foreign interests. And Washington heard it loud and clear. The very next week, Senator James Risch introduced a dagger, quiet, legislative, lethal. An amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, demanding a 90-day reassessment of Kenya's major non-NATO ally status. A classified report would follow, 180 days later, scrutinizing Kenya's every move. But here's the twist: it wasn't about Kenya's moves. It was about Kenya's mindset. Washington wasn't punishing Ruto for doing something dangerous. It was punishing him for thinking freely. The amendment's language spoke volumes. Kenya's ties with China, with Russia, with Iran. Its alleged flirtation with the Rapid Support Forces of Sudan. Its so-called failure to prevent abductions during protests. It read like a diplomatic rap sheet. But the real charge was this: non-compliance with Western control. For years, Kenya had played its part. It hosted U.S. bases in Manda and Wager. It received over $1 billion in military support. It was the West's eastern anchor in Africa's Horn. But then came a sentence that changed everything. We are co-architects of a new world order. Not partners. Not followers. Co-architects. And the West recoiled. This wasn't just arrogance. To them, it was apostasy. They scrambled for leverage. $225 million in U.S. aid. Terminated. Anti-corruption programs. Slashed. Wildlife conservation. Cancelled. It wasn't aid, they admitted, it was obedience. The Pentagon raised alarm bells. What if Kenya turned its ports into Belt and Road hubs? What if Chinese tech replaced Western arms? What if, just what if, Africa stopped asking for permission? The classified report would look for terror links, human rights violations, foreign entanglements. But these were fig leaves. The real sin was defiance. And that's where the fear began. Because Ruto didn't backpedal. He doubled down. In a private sector forum in Nairobi, he calmly explained, "Our engagement with China corrects decades of imbalance. It's not betrayal. It's sovereignty." He didn't shout. He didn't blame. He just refused to bow. If you believe sovereignty isn't a privilege, it's a birthright, leave a comment. Let the world see how many stand with Kenya, with Africa, with dignity. Because something is shifting. And those in power, they know it. You can see it in how fast the retaliation came. How eager Washington was to equate trade with treason. How quickly independence became allegiance to China. But Kenya wasn't declaring loyalty to another superpower. It was declaring loyalty to itself. And that terrified them. For years, the West operated on one assumption: that Africa would always need permission. That its leaders would always need help. That its dreams would always come second. But now, finally, one leader stepped outside the circle. And the silence from other African leaders. It wasn't weakness. It was calculation. Because they were watching. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, South Africa, Algeria. Watching how Washington punishes independence. Watching how quickly friendship becomes threat. Watching and planning. And perhaps most dangerously for the West, they were learning. Ruto's defiance may have cost him weapons. It may cost him votes. It may cost him deals. But it bought him something bigger. A legacy. And perhaps even more. A movement. Because sovereignty isn't about isolation. It's about ownership. Of choices. Of partnerships. Of futures. And in that moment, in Beijing, in 26 words, Ruto claimed ownership. The cost will be high. Sanctions will come. Threats will follow. But the leash is broken. And now, the question the West can't answer. What happens when Africa stops obeying? They called it aid. But what is aid, when it comes with a leash? In 2025, the United States slashed $225 million in assistance to Kenya, no warning, no discussion. Gone were funds for wildlife conservation. Gone were educational programs. Gone were anti-corruption efforts that Washington had once hailed as vital. And the reason? Kenya dared to sit at China's table. Let's be clear. This wasn't diplomacy. It was discipline. Because to the West, aid isn't about partnership, it's about positioning. You stay in line, you get rewarded. You drift, you get punished. For decades, the United States has played this game across Africa. Each grant, each contract, each military training program was a thread. And when stitched together, they formed a web. Not of cooperation, but of control. And like any spider, the West waited. Watching. Monitoring. And when a fly twitched out of place, strike. That's what happened to Kenya. The outrage wasn't that Kenya broke a rule. It's that Kenya rejected the role it was assigned. Let's rewind. The Mombasa-Nairobi SGR Railway, funded by China, became a symbol. Not just of infrastructure, but of independence. Western headlines called it a debt trap. But Kenyans called it movement. Connection. Progress. So when Ruto stood beside Xi Jinping in 2025 and called China a co-architect, it wasn't just a compliment. It was a rebellion. A rebellion that the West couldn't afford to let spread. So they reached for the oldest weapon in the colonial playbook. Starve the defiant. Cut funding. Cut ties. Cut the narrative. Suddenly, U.S. media was flooded with segments questioning Ruto's loyalty. Think tanks wrote white papers on Kenya's strategic drift. Anonymous sources whispered of alarming Chinese influence. But let's test this logic. Where was the media storm when Egypt jailed dissidents en masse? When Israel bombed civilians? When Saudi Arabia carved up journalists in foreign embassies? No aid was cut. No partnerships paused. Because they were loyal. This is not about human rights. It's about hierarchy. Kenya's real crime wasn't repression. It was insubordination. The selective outrage reeks of hypocrisy. And every African nation watching knows it. This is the Hollywood version of geopolitics. Good guy, bad guy. Order, chaos. But always, always, the West is the director. Until one day, the actors go off script. That's what Kenya did. And suddenly, the spotlight turned hostile. It wasn't just aid. It was security partnerships. Military cooperation. Defense intelligence. All under review. All threatened. Because if one nation gets away with disobedience, others might try. And the show collapses. If you're tired of the same script, where Africa plays the role of client, partner, or problem, say something. Write, Africa decides, in the comments. Let this algorithm know, we are done playing characters in someone else's story. Because the cost of this game is too high. The US says Kenya can't be trusted with high-tech weapons if it's aligned with China. But who defines alignment? When France sells jets to India while India trades with Russia, no one panics. When NATO allies do business with Iran behind closed doors, no headlines follow. But when an African country signs a rail deal, it's treason. This isn't a security review. It's a loyalty test. And the problem is, loyalty, in this world, isn't mutual. It's submission. Aid isn't free. Loans come with locks. Partnerships are contracts in invisible ink. And when you read the fine print, it always says, you belong to us. But what happens when that paper burns? Ruto lit a match. So did Goita. So did Traore. From the Sahel to the Horn, the fire is spreading. Because Africans are doing something unthinkable. Asking questions. Why is NATO in Africa? Why does the IMF dictate our schools and hospitals? Why does every drone strike in Somalia have an American fingerprint? Why must we choose between China and America, when neither ever chose us? This isn't anti-West. It's post-West. A different chapter. Written by Africans. For Africans. With no narrator but our own. It's uncomfortable. It's unpredictable. And that's why they fear it. Because for the first time in centuries, Africa is not asking for a seat at the table. Africa is building its own table. On its own land. With its own tools. And no one, no alliance, no acronym, gets to decide who sits at it. The mask of aid is slipping. And behind it, coercion, control, fear. But Africa has seen this face before. And this time, we remember its name. What do you gain by staying silent? A seat at a table you'll never control. A partnership that starts with a warning and ends with a threat. The leaders of Africa are awakening to a reality long buried under diplomacy. You cannot negotiate freedom with those who profit from your chains. And that awakening is no longer a whisper. It is a storm. From Nairobi to Ouagadougou, from Bamako to Pretoria. One message echoes louder each day. Sovereignty is not a slogan. It is survival. Kenya's defiance didn't exist in a vacuum. It triggered something deeper, an ancestral memory. Of kings who ruled. Of lands untamed. Of voices not yet colonized. And across the continent, other voices joined in. Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. Assimi Goïta of Mali. Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger. They were already expelling French troops. Already rejecting IMF conditionalities. Already building the AES alliance, a military, economic, and moral pact. But now, they saw Kenya, far from the Sahel, face the same whip in a different hand. And they nodded. Because the hand may change, but the leash is always the same. What happens when the continent sees the pattern? It stops being angry, and starts being organized. That's the real fear in Washington. Not just rebellion, but revolution. Imagine it. A continental development bank, free from IMF strings. A standing African defense force, not funded by NATO, but by cobalt, lithium, oil. A digital currency backed by African gold. A permanent seat at the UN Security Council, not as guests, but as equals. This isn't a fantasy. It's a roadmap. And it's being drawn by leaders who once walked separate paths. But now they walk as one. Even South Africa, long seen as the West's favorite interlocutor, is speaking a different language. When questioned about BRICS expansion, they no longer apologize. They assert. Algeria, long locked in Maghreb politics, is offering military and economic coordination with Sahel states. Ethiopia is demanding respect, not relief. And Egypt, quietly, carefully, is listening. This is not a rejection of the West. It is a rejection of dependence. For 60 years, Africa has been asked to choose. America or China? Democracy or development? Aid or dignity? But what if the answer is none of the above? What if Africa chooses Africa? If you believe in an Africa that writes its own destiny, comment your country's name below. Let the world know, sovereignty isn't theory. It's personal. Because sovereignty is the right to say no, without punishment. The right to walk away, without consequence. The right to choose your friends, without chains. And right now, that right is under siege. The US is reviewing Kenya's MNNA status. France is doubling down on Niger sanctions. The EU is pressuring ECOWAS to isolate Mali and Burkina Faso. This is not policy. This is panic. They are not defending order. They are defending ownership. But here's the truth they can't unlearn. Once a people have seen the bars of the cage, they can never again call it a palace. Kenya saw the bars, then shook them, then walked through them. And now, the gate is open. Who will walk through next? Africa's choice is no longer about diplomacy. It is about dignity. It is about refusing to be the continent of almost. Almost stable. Almost independent. Almost respected. Silence is surrender. They told us it was about stability. About keeping the peace. About shared values. But now, the mask is off. Because the West isn't afraid of China. It isn't afraid of Ruto. It isn't even afraid of losing Kenya. What terrifies them? Is Africa uniting without them? Think about it. A continent of 1.4 billion people. Owning the gold they mine. Setting the price of the cobalt they dig. Controlling the ports they built. And speaking to the world, not in 54 fractured voices, but as one. That vision. Not war. Not oil. But unity. Is the real threat. Because unity ends the monopoly. No more divide and conquer. No more hiding behind regional partnerships. No more picking one puppet over another. If Kenya can defy Washington and survive, Burkina Faso might do more than survive. Mali might expand. Niger might consolidate. And suddenly, the Sahel isn't a problem. It's a block. A force. An alliance built not on fear, but on clarity. Clarity that sovereignty isn't about isolation. It's about coordination. And the West. They see it. That's why they flooded headlines with terror ties. Why they panicked over Chinese influence. Why they used every NGO. Every ambassador, every dollar like a chess piece. Not to stop chaos. But to stop cohesion. Because cohesion means negotiation. And negotiation means compromise. And compromise means power is no longer theirs alone. That's the twist. This was never about terrorism. It was about territory. Not about human rights. But human resources. Not about defending democracy. But defending dominance. They're not afraid Africa will fall apart. They're afraid Africa will finally fall into place. And the moment it does. The moment these flags stop flying solo. The moment these voices stop speaking alone. The moment these leaders look left and right and realize. We are no longer outnumbered. We are the number. That's when the world map changes. And it's already begun. The battle was never just about Kenya. It was never just about China, or aid, or alliances. It was about this moment. This choice. This awakening. The chains were never just metal. They were headlines. Loans. Conditions. Fear. And one by one, those chains are breaking. Ruto said 26 words. But across the continent, millions are answering back. With courage. With clarity. With conviction. Africa is not rising because the world allows it. Africa is rising because the world can no longer stop it. So now we ask you. Not to watch. Not to cheer. But to stand. If the fire of sovereignty burns in you, like it does in Kenya, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, then like. Comment. Subscribe. Because this is not just a video. It is a vow. To speak louder. To stand firmer. To rise. Together.